Hello, in this video we're going to learn how to use the computer-based model that accompanies this book. Now I should mention that the model of short-run macroeconomic equilibrium in the book comes in stages of increasing complexity and increasing nuance. We start off at the most basic level with a closed economy, we moved on to the open economy, we look at fiscal considerations, and then we even add some foreign risk premia and also financial market frictions. Accordingly, the computer model is also in stages of increasing complexity. We are at the most basic stage. We're going to call this stage 1A. And in this video, we're going to look at how we implement shocks to aggregate demand, the IS curve, with and without monetary accommodation. And we're also going to look at shocks to the aggregate supply curve. We call that guy PBS, with and without any monetary accommodation. Now, let's look at this next sheet. It's called Equations of the Model. This is our cheat sheet. We're going to have to go back to it occasionally to sort of envisage how the shocks will affect the different curves in the graphical representation of the model. So now we're going to go to the main sheet, and this is called Stage 1A Interface. And you can see here, if you'll just give me just 1 second to zero things out here, because these are the shocks that we're zeroing out. Okay, the first step is that we have to specify macroeconomic shocks that may occur. Those shocks could be shocks to aggregate demand. At this stage, we're going to be considering fiscal policy as just a shock to aggregate demand. Later on, we'll be thinking of it as a policy shock, but right now, we just think of it as a shock to aggregate demand, a spending shock, for example. We can think of shocks to expected inflation. We have to keep in mind that the target rate of inflation is about 2.4%, and expectations are exactly aligned with the target. We have full credibility, so this is also 2.4%. And then we think of production-based shocks, or shocks to the short-run aggregate supply curve. We've abbreviated these as PBS. Okay, now the second step is to look at monetary policy measures. These are discretionary departures from a Taylor rule. We're going to call this R-DISC, and we can have discretionary loosening or discretionary tightening. So these are the different kinds of shocks. We have a baseline scenario in which there are no shocks, and then we have two alternative scenarios where we are permitted to put in shocks that reflect different assumptions. So let's look at our first set of assumptions, or our first experiment, and that would be an increase in aggregate demand. And this could be coming from the fiscal, but it also could be coming from the private sector. Either way, it doesn't matter at this stage of the analysis. We're going to assume that this shock to aggregate demand is 1.5% of potential output. So these shocks are measured in terms of potential output. So you can see what happens here. The IS curve shifts from the solid red curve over here to this dotted red line, and you can see that output increases. You can see that the interest rate rises. Why? Because as we go along the RT curve, the central bank, which is sticking to its Taylor rule, is obliged to raise interest rates in order to choke off demand and to restrain inflation. Notice that the central bank hasn't completely restrained inflation here, that inflation is now higher than it was under the baseline because of the higher output gap. Okay. Now I want to mention that in addition to the graphical representation, we also have this. We can also think of these things in just plain English language here. So this shock here was more demand on the IS curve, and that was reflected in an upturn of aggregate output, an upturn of the output gap, a higher real interest rate, also a higher nominal interest rate, and also higher inflation according to the Phillips curve. Okay, so now let's put a little wrinkle in here. Okay, we're going to put 1.5% again, so we're going to keep with the assumption that aggregate demand has increased by 1.5%, but in addition, we're going to assume that the central bank accommodates that increase in aggregate demand, and what's going to happen here is that the central bank will loosen its interest rate, and I've chosen a number, and you'll see why I've chosen it in just a second. And you can see here that that when the central bank loosens monetary policy, it departs from its Taylor rule in a discretionary loosening, and you can see that the real interest rate is just about where it was when we started out under the baseline. This interest rate is 2.8%, and it's called the natural rate of interest. It's the interest rate that we observed when there were no shocks. You can see also what happens that when we have a more accommodative monetary policy, that's also going to mean that we're going to encourage more aggregate demand, so we'll have a higher output gap under alternative 2 than we will have under alternative 1, but at a price of higher inflation here under alternative 2 than alternative 1. That also shouldn't be surprising. And if we go down here to our verbal description, we find that yes, we had more demand, same as in alternative 1. We had a discretionary loosening of monetary policy that did result in an upturn, an even larger upturn than under alternative 1. You'll see that it says lower real interest rate, but we can see that that's really not by much. We didn't exactly get back to the real interest rate under the baseline, but it's about there. It's slightly lower. Yes, we did raise the nominal interest rate, but we also had higher inflation, so apparently we didn't raise the nominal interest rate high enough to increase the real interest rate above its baseline value. So that's our aggregate demand experiment. Now let's clean things up here, and let's zero everything out, and let's zero everything out here, and let's now go to our aggregate supply experiment. So this is going to be an adverse shock to the aggregate supply curve. We think of this, for example, as a bad harvest, or it could be an oil price increase. Now, before we start plugging in numbers, it's a good idea to go back to our cheat sheet and just to think about how the curves are going to shift. Now, here is the Phillips curve, and it shouldn't be surprising that when we have an adverse shock to aggregate supply, that's going to raise the inflation rate. We already knew that because we studied the Phillips curve several chapters back, but it's also important to note that we have substituted in the Phillips curve into the nominal Taylor rule, and that's how we obtain this real Taylor rule, the RT curve. So the idea here is that this curve, this real Taylor rule, will also have to shift upwards when we have an adverse shock to the short-run aggregate supply curve. So let's go back and let's put in, and this is going to be a fairly sizable shock to short-run aggregate supply curve. Let's put it minus 2.5%. Okay, and you can see that what happened is exactly what I said was going to happen. First of all, down here on the Phillips curve, we know that inflation rises, so the Phillips curve has to shift, and in fact, yes, it does shift. It shifts from this solid green line to this sort of dotted green line here. Now, what happens in terms of output? Well, we know that the central bank, if it stays on its Taylor rule, it has to restrain some of that additional inflation. Otherwise, as we learn a little bit later in the book, the inflation rate can actually get out of control. So instead, we're doing what we like to think of as a preemptive tightening here, and that means that at a higher real interest rate than under the baseline, we're also going to have a lower output gap. The output gap in this case will be negative. We will call this a downturn or a recession that resulted from the adverse oil price shock. Okay, so that's that. And we can see down here, looking at the verbal description, we have an adverse shock. It resulted in a downturn. It resulted in a higher real interest rate. We also, not surprisingly, got higher inflation rate and higher nominal interest rate. Okay? Now let's make things a little bit more complicated. Let's say that we have a central bank that actually worries about perhaps the output gap in this period, although is probably not thinking about higher inflation in the future. That kind of central bank will actually accommodate this shock, and we're going to put in a number, and I'll have to be very candid with you. This number is a number that I investigated before I did the video, and by the way, it's minus 0.6. I have to remind you that we have to put in, when we have numbers less than 1, in absolute terms, we have to put in the percent sign explicitly, otherwise the model will blow up. So here we go, minus 0.6%. Now you can see what's happened here is that under alternative 2, we are back where we were before. We have a higher we have a higher output gap, and we have a lower interest rate. That shouldn't be surprising because that's the policy that the central bank chose. But guess what? We're going to have a higher rate of inflation. Why? Just because we did a discretionary loosening doesn't mean that the Phillips curve shifts back. The Phillips curve stays where it is, so that's one reason why we have this higher rate of inflation. But in addition, on this new Phillips curve, we also have a higher output gap. That's going to mean an even higher rate of inflation. So let's take a look here at how we summarize this scenario in English. We had an adverse shock to supply. It was offset with a discretionary loosening of monetary policy. We get a slight downturn here, but you can see just by looking at the chart that in fact it isn't very much, that we're actually back at our zero output gap. Okay. Now I should say that at the next stage of the model, we'll actually be able to see some numbers, and you'll be able to do the calculation that will get you those numbers. The same thing here is for the higher real interest rate. It's only slightly higher, as you can see here in the graph. It's essentially what it was under the baseline, but also you can see that we're going to have higher rates of inflation than we would have had either under alternative 1 or the baseline. Now, this is a one-period analysis. It turns out that if our new higher rate of inflation carries over into higher expectations of inflation in the future, our monetary accommodation today, even though it seems like a kind thing to do for the central bank to accommodate and to avoid a recession, it could this seemingly kind policy choice by the central bank could result in higher inflation in the future and also much more pain in trying to get the inflation rate down in the future. But that's another story. This is just a one-period analysis.